Good morning, everyone, from here in Vancouver. Welcome to our dive into databases for FME 2018. This is the first webinar in our summer school series. These webinars are extended versions of some of the presentations that we gave during our recent world tour trips over the last couple of months. I'm Mark Stokes, and with me today is Tia McKillop. Hi, Tia.
Hello.
Our agenda is pretty straightforward for our Database Explorer. We're going to review some of the new features in FME 2018 that pertain to databases, doing a database overview. And then we're going to do, along the way, a few demos. Just before we start, I was wondering if we could have a show of hands from everybody to see who uses databases in their day-to-day work for when you're working with FME. Quite a few of you, I think. Yep, there's a whole raft of people who use databases for in their day-to-day work. So that's not too surprising. It's usually quite a few, majority of people who do use databases.
Yeah,
okay, Tia, over to you.
All right, so let's start with what's new in FME 2018. So we're just going to go over the database updates we have. First of all, some new formats. We have a new Teradata reader and writer. We have had Teradata before, but now we've completely revamped it. It is JDBC, and this is both spatial and non-spatial. As well as we've introduced SAP HANA as a reader and writer, both JDBC and spatial and non-spatial. And this allows you to read GeoDatabase on SAP HANA now. And then lastly, we've introduced the ESRI GeoDatabase Mosaic Dataset Writer. And what this does is it takes images of the rasters and it will perform mosaic on them. So I'll just pop out now to show you a brief demo of this. So what I have here is I have a couple of different raster images. And then I'm just going to write them out using our file GeoDatabase Mosaic Dataset Writer. So we have it for both ArcSDE and File GeoDatabase. What's good to note in the writer is we have our normal database parameters here, but we also have these update overviews, and that's going to be what your pyramids are. So you can set this to yes or no, and then it's going to create those overviews for you. We also have various other parameters such as the compression type and everything like that. Oh no. I'm writing to an existing one, so I'm not able to do an update, but I'll show you that existing Mosaic dataset I have in ArcGIS here. So you can see that I have my different raster images, as well as the overviews that I've created. So I actually have it stored in my GeoDatabase, and then I have the overviews stored in a separate folder here, and these are all my raster images there as well.
So I think the idea of the raster mosaics is that the original images are still in the original folder. Is that correct? And then the overviews are in the overview directory, and really the GeoDatabase is just a catalog of all those images. I think that's how it works.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Thank you, Mark. We've also made some updates and changes to our database harmonization efforts. So we've added the FME DB operation to both file GeoDatabase. This is the API, the non-API versions. So this allows you to do your insert, updates, and deletes all through one writer feature type. We've added the where clause to the file GeoDatabase and to ArcSDE. Now these where clauses are going to have a huge impact on your performance if you're using them. In our Let the Database Do the Work webinar that we did last year, we found that when we read in a table and then used a test filter, it took about 30 seconds, but had we applied that same test onto a where clause, it only took about 5 seconds to read in. So you're going to see a lot of performance increase if you're able to use these where clauses in your FME translations. We've also added the SQL before and after, so we've done that to file GeoDatabase, ArcSDE, or pardon me, SQL Server, and ODBC and JDBC. Some updates to existing formats. We've added XML support to SQL Server and DB2. We've added JSON support to Oracle and MySQL, and this is for Oracle 12c because that's the one that's going to support the JSON data type. We've added curved geometry support to GeoPackage, and then we've also added the option to do selective attribute support for GeoDatabase ArcSDE. So this means you can check off which attributes you want to expose and read in on your reader.
And that's another idea around let the database do the work, in the sense that if you don't read the data, then FME is not going to fill up memory and you're going to use less memory. Is that right?
Exactly. So with this, you're effectively doing a select and then selecting whichever columns from your table, and then you can apply a where clause as well. So that's going to reduce your number of columns and rows that you're reading in. So new to 2018, we've introduced a new transformer here for you. It's the feature joiner, and what this is, it's a faster transformer than the feature merger. It's simpler and it uses standard SQL language. So your features are just going to fly out of this thing because it is quite fast. It uses our feature table technology. And you're able to do inner, left, and full joins. Of course, you can do a right join if you just flip your tables that are coming in. And then you can just select your join on attribute as well. There is some other options in there, but when I pop up for the demo, I'll just show you those a bit more.
So feature joiner is a cousin of feature merger?
Yes.
So feature merger is a complicated transformer for doing joins, but it's a very old legacy kind of transformer in FME now. So we're hoping the feature joiner will make it easier for people to use, for you to use, and generally more performance as well.
Yes, exactly. So if the feature joiner is like the feature merger's better looking cousin. So here are the type of joins you can do if you're not familiar with database joins, but judging by the little poll Mark did beforehand, most of you I'd expect to know this, but the important thing to know with the feature joiners, make sure you know your data. It's going to do an implicit one-to-many or many-to-many join, so make sure that that's what you want to do before you're using this transformer. So I have a workspace here. So what I've done is I'm reading in some CSV data from Census, and then I'm going to merge it using, join it using the feature joiner here. As you can see from the CSV, I've got 62,000 records, and from my Stats Canada, which is map info, it's about just under 1,000. When I run this, you're going to see that the feature joiner is able to join these two data sets.
Whoa, look at those
fast.
numbers come up, 62,000 instantaneously.
Yeah, so the nice thing is both these formats are feature table enabled, so they're going to be reading faster. Then they're going to be hitting the feature joiner, which is also feature table enabled, which is going to be joining super fast as well. I think the longest part of this workspace is actually writing out to the final KML file, which I'll just show you now. So what we've done here is we've just merged our data together. So our census data with our little census tracks as well, using the feature joiner. We've updated the feature, so I won't go into too much details with this because Mark's going to be using it in his demo later on. But what we've done is we've added an attribute on your summary feature. So what you can do is you can pass in an attribute to continue on that summary feature. So for those of you who've used the feature writer before, you know that this summary feature comes out and tells you the number of records. Now you can store like a count beforehand and use it later on in your database or your translation to compare. We've also added an output port. So whatever you send into the feature writer, you now have the option to send it out of the feature writer once it has successfully written out to whichever format you're looking at.
So feature writer and its cousin, the feature reader, they kind of changed the paradigm of the way that you can work in FME. Traditionally, when we author a workflow, we have readers and writers, and it's kind of hard to do something before you read the data, and similarly, it's hard to do something after you've written the data, and that's what the before SQL and end SQL that Tia mentioned earlier is for. But if you use a feature reader as a transformer, it means that you can do stuff before you read the data in. And if you use the feature writer, it means you can do processing to the data or the summary features after you've written the data. And we'll do a demo in a minute about that. But it does change the whole structure of your workflow if you start to use those two transformers.
Exactly. It allows you to read or write mid-translation, which is useful in a lot of scenarios.
Okay, well, that's a good segue, I guess, over to me. So I'm going to just change the presenter here. And okay, so I'm going to just carry on and talk about some of the ideas that we've presented in the past about letting the database do the work, and that should help you improve the performance of some of your database transformations. But before I get into that, I wanted to just mention something that Tia and one of our colleagues, Steve McCabe, has also been investigating, and that is reducing the risk of data loads when you're using FME to load your databases. And we've been talking to quite a few customers and users of FME around their strategies for reducing risk when you're doing data loads. And this is about really what happens if your database load stalls and something goes wrong during the database load. And so David Rexton at INSA, he said he prefers his approach is to use staging tables. And so he'll load his first cut of data into a staging table, validate those, and then if his tables validate, he'll load those tables into production. Of course, if you've got mandatory fields or other relationships, sometimes that's a good thing to do if you've got child tables, parent and child tables, or other joins. Eric at Spatial Biz, he uses a variety of approaches to reduce his database load risk depending on the kind of data he's loading. So one is to set the FME transaction to a very small value, 1. And then when a failure happens, it's very easy to trace that problem. If you have a transaction interval, typically it's 500 or 1,000 features inserted in a transaction, and something fails in that transaction, the whole transaction is rolled back. So it's kind of hard to isolate the bad feature that caused that failure. The other approach is to go to the other extreme and set a very large transaction interval. And then if there's a failure, the whole load will get rolled back. Now, depending on the database you're using, that can cause headaches for your DBA administrator, because you would then need large temp files or temp spaces to hold those transactions until the very end. So in some cases, annoying your DBA is not the best strategy either. And then he also suggests using staging tables, validate those prior to loading the data into the production fields. Dave Ellerbeck from Global Information Systems, he's using FME a lot to do large data loads, and he uses the ignore fail features on his GeoDatabase writer. So that's a feature on our GeoDatabase writer that you can just ignore fail features and the whole write will continue. And also he uses the SQL executor, which I'll show in a minute, just to manage his relationship kind of inserts. And then Barbara Stefan in Germany, she uses FME to load large numbers of tables. I'm not quite sure what her workflow is there, but again, she likes to use staging tables and she validates those, I believe, with FME. She's written an FME script to do that validation, if I'm correct. And then she uses FME to mirror those staging tables into production. So those are all strategies different people are using to reduce risk when loading data into databases. We'd love to hear from anybody who's got ideas of their own thoughts on how to do that. And that might guide our future development on our database writers to handle these kind of situations where you're loading data sets and you want to reduce the risk and what your data recovery strategies are. So what I wanted to do was just to go through a bit of a contrived example, but just a little workflow to illustrate some of the things that Tia has been talking about and how to get the database to do the work and how to maybe reduce some of the risk. So what I've got here is a little data set in a Geo package, which is a SQLite-based GIS package from the OGC. And so what we've got here is somebody's using the Geo package as a mobile platform. They've taken an area of interest in Vancouver, near where I live, and they've done some edits on that data. And now somebody has given them a work order to work on the Stokes house here down on 19th in Quebec. So that's out of the area of interest that they first downloaded. So what they want to do is they want to add that, second set of data to their Geo package without overriding the first set of data that they had. So this is the little workflow that we've built around that to illustrate some of these ideas. So let's just go and have a look at that workspace and see how that workspace actually operates. Okay, so just walking through some of the ideas around some of the earlier discussions that we've had here. First is let the database do the work. So on my file GeoDatabase here, that's the source of my data. We've got a where clause here. So that where clause allows the user to select what neighborhood they want to extract that data from. And so that's a field on all the records in the data set, so that when we run this workflow, we can select which neighborhood we want to add to that Geo package. So that's reducing the amount of data that we read. In this case, also eliminating overlap of data sets so that we don't overwrite the original set of data that this person had loaded into the Geo package.
And Mark's doing that with a published parameter there. That's why he's getting that drop-down list that you see when he goes to run.
Yep. So I've created a published parameter. Thanks to there's the published parameter there in my where clause, and in my published parameters here, select the neighborhood. If we edit the definition, you can see it's a choice list, and this is my list of choices for the different neighborhoods in beautiful Vancouver here. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to do some validation on the data, and what we're going to make sure I get the right data load. And so what I'm going to do there is just do a row count on the original tables that I have in my Geo package. And so that's where I can use SQL Executor. And so this is where using the feature writer allows us to do some work before we write and afterwards. So first of all, what we're going to do is just do a simple query to the 3 tables that we've got there, just to do a row count, and just count the original number of rows, so that when we add some more rows to the database, we can see how many rows were added by how many rows FME thought it added versus how many actually got added to the database. So I've got the samplers here just to select one feature from each and send that off to the SQL executor so we don't execute that multiple times. And then here we've got the feature writer, and in the feature writer we've got that new parameter on the summary attributes, so we can pass additional fields on the summary attribute here. So these are the attributes I'm passing, and I'm passing across the rows before, so that's the number of rows in each table before this table was written. And also here what I'm doing is I'm passing through the features that I've just written as well. So what I'm doing is I'm writing to the staging tables in the feature writer. And so these are the 3 staging tables that I'm writing to. And then if that all works, what we'll do is we'll pass those staging tables across to the production tables in our little geo package. What happens in the feature writer is that the first feature to come out of here is actually the summary feature. So one summary feature comes out, tells us how all the data was written, or FME thinks it was written. And what I can do then is once I've written that data to the staging tables, we can do another check on the tables. In this case, again, I'm just doing a row count. And if the number of rows in the row count, that's the number of rows that were actually written to the staging tables, matches the number of rows that were actually written, then this thing will pass. If that fails, we hit the very final transformer here, which is the terminator, which will just stop the whole translation. And by stopping the translation, it means that it won't load the staging tables into the next feature writer, which is moving the staging data to the production tables. So if we run this thing, we can see the workflow through the feature clouds. We're reading all the tables, doing the queries to do the row counts. Summary feature went out, and because that test passed over here, we then carried on and moved the staging tables to the feature writer, which writes those staging tables to the production tables. Now, if something fails, so what I'm going to do here is just actually do a bit of a contrived thing and just create a failure in the workflow. What will happen is the summary feature will come out here, we'll do a test, and that test will fail, and that will hit the terminator, which means that these intermediate staging tables are not going to get written to my final production tables. Now, you could replace the feature writer with some SQL just to do those final data loads if you wanted to. So there we have a nice feature here, filters on the log file to quickly find out where your errors are. What happened there, the error is that it hit the terminator transformer, and that stopped the translation. And you can see here, none of the staging tables data was written across to or passed across to the feature writer, which is going to move that data across to the production tables. And we can do other post writer operations as well here. We can do some more SQL. So you can see here that using the feature writer instead of a traditional writer, we can do a lot of work after the data was written out. We can do validation on the data, in this case using some SQL, simple SQL. We can write other data using another feature writer. If you want to do that, we can trigger those writes. And after you do that, you can do more work after you've written that second set of data. So there's a lot of flexibility when it comes to using the feature writer and its cousin, which I didn't use here, the feature reader instead of a traditional reader. Okay, and kind of at the end of our webinar here, I wanted to mention some work we're doing with our colleagues at ESRI. ESRI have just released a new product they call the ESRI Utility Network Management Extension, working in Arc Pro. And so what is happening there, if anybody is working in ArcGIS with network kind of information, water, gas, electric kind of networks in ArcGIS, those data structures used in ArcGIS are changing quite a lot, moving into the Utility Network Management Extension. And so we've been working with ESRI to help them pull together a migration workflow for those tools. And so we have some migration workspaces available. Currently, those released are for water and gas. We're just about to put out an electric one. There's two levels of kind of migration, basic and simple. So basic is really just moving the data across, and so that's more of a kind of a big schema mapping process. For more complex workflows, particularly in electric, so we call those a simple conversion. More complex structures are built. So in an electric network, for example, what will happen is a fuse will be expanded into its individual components, such as an arrestor and the fuse and the original assembly. So the migration workflow that we have there will do those sort of feature expansions as well, building what we've been referring to as high fidelity devices. And then the next step is, so that is all written to a staging GeoDatabase called the asset package. And then there's an ESRI tool that you use to take that asset package and load it into the utility network database. And we're also at the moment working on a new reader and writer for utility networks, which will essentially be similar to AGOL or portal read and writers that use the utility network feature services to read and write those data sets, because that will be the only way that you can get data in or out of the utility network as things go forward. So they don't suggest accessing the GeoDatabase underneath directly, if that's even possible, actually. So again, anybody who's interested in or working with utility networks or ESRI utility products in general, and maybe looking at that utility network migration, feel free to talk to us or our colleagues at ESRI, and they will help you get moving on that.
Great. So Mark and I wanted to point out all of the different resources available for anyone who wants more information on working with databases in FME. We have quite a few tutorials on the Knowledge Center. So we have Oracle, Postgres, SQL Server, ESRI, Small World. So these are more basic tutorials, you're just getting started. We also have so Mark has it up there. So he does have a landing page to go to. And then there's also the Let the Database Do the Work tutorial, and that's the one I referenced earlier about the different performance. So in this one, we're looking at ways to increase our...
we would be looking, oh, there we go.
We're looking at different ways. So there's 3 articles in this tutorial series. One of them is reading, so how to increase your read speed, so using where clause or the feature reader or other functionalities like that. And then there's also a writing article, and then that one's looking at writing with foreign keys, so what to do when you're writing to a table that has constraints. And then lastly, we have our tips and tricks section, and that's just some common pitfalls we've seen people run into when working with databases in FME, and just things that can help you make better use of your time when you're working with them. So things like auto connect or using the SQL before and after, just various little tips that we've found along the way.
And there's always webinars, so we have a ton of webinars around databases as well. And if you are working or looking at working with ArcGIS utility networks, Trent has put together a article on that to give you access to the resources. We're in the process of building a little online training module for that, so people who have to go through that process can go there. And there's a link here to learning more about utility networks, takes you to the ESRI site. And then these links here take you to ESRI community pages that have the workflows for the water and gas that have been released up to this point. And soon, relatively soon, will be the electric ones.
I should also point out on the community, besides the articles, there is a Q&A forum. So if you have any database questions, feel free to post them there and other users can help you out. It's
Absolutely.
also a great way to learn other questions because maybe someone's, encountered the same problem as you.
Yep. As you type your new question,
Yeah.
Other similar questions will pop up.
Mm-hmm. And then there's also the ideas exchange. So if there's anything you want to see in FME, look and file in a new idea. You can also browse and upvote ones that you think would be a good functionality for us to implement. And we do look at this stuff into consideration for what to develop. So please do vote for ideas that you think would be really great for us to have.
And in Tia's new role as a product owner, if you write nice, clear ideas, then it'll make her job a lot. Yeah. Okay, so we have one poll question that we would just like to wrap up the day with, and that's around whether you're interested in more resources to work with the various database tools that we have. So we're going to give you the opportunity to vote on which resources you would like to have, and then maybe you can send us a note as to what kind of things that we can do to help you get the best out of your data specifically. So if you've got any specific thoughts, fire those off to us. Yeah. And it's
looks like
quite a spread there. So what do I do next? Close the poll to show everybody what those results are. So that's good. Lots of what happened there? Share. There we go. So lots of, I did share it for a minute. Anyway.
There we go. It's up. So lots of votes for ESRI GeoDatabase.
Yeah, so that's a good tip for us. Thanks a lot, SQL Server and then Oracle and Postgres. So great. That's super. Okay, so our webinar series will continue for summer school data, FME summer school camp or something.
Summer camp. Who's doing summer school? Summer camp, yeah. So the next one is July 25th, and that's the web data and reporting zipline, I guess it's called. Yeah, so tune into that one if that's something you're interested in.
And that pretty well wraps up our webinar for today. We'll have a look through some of the questions that were in there. Maybe we'll ask Trent to see if there's any questions that really stand out there in the list. As always, we'll publish the examples and the webinar materials itself up to our webpage, and so that you can use those examples, and you'll get a follow-up email with the links to those resources. If there's any follow-up questions, we'll do those after this webinar.
So I see a question that's asking about the where clause. When I mentioned it for the file GeoDatabase and ArcSTE, that's now on the feature type. So I know previously we had it on the reader itself, but we've added it onto the feature type as well, like Mark demonstrated. So we were able to do it per table or per feature type.
Yeah, so that's a huge change. That gives us way more granularity. So the where clause is still here, and that applies to all the data that you read, which you could have used in this case because everything was sampling the neighborhood. But by adding the where clause to the feature type here, it means you can have different where clauses for different features, which is more common.
Yes.
Okay, well, I think what we'll do is we'll just have a little time here to answer some of the questions that have come in online. But outside of that, I think we're going to close the webinar, which has been a summary of what we gave at the FME World Tour. And it's goodbye for me. And
goodbye, everyone.